To set the stage for this discussion, I first want to acknowledge just how far back recovery goes historically in what we know as the United States. Organized recovery, as I've researched it, dates in the United States to the 1730s, and a series of Delaware prophets who, behind their own recovery from alcoholism, organized abstinence-based cultural and religious revitalization movements, the largest of which will later be the Handsome Lake movement that will evolve into the Longhouse religion, which continues to exist today. The central tenet of the Handsome Lake movement was a rejection of alcohol and a rejection of all other European folkways, and a return to native traditions and native folkways. We see behind the Handsome Lake movement a long series of prophet movements. The Shawnee prophet and the Kickapoo prophet that's going to then in the late 1800s emerge in the form of the Indian Shaker Church and the Native American Church. And we could actually continue this history forward within Native communities through the 20th century with the rise of culturally indigenous sobriety movements, including the beginning Indianization of Alcoholics Anonymous in the 1950s, the emergence of the concept of the Red Road in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and the emergence of the contemporary Wellbriety movement that has rapidly spread through Native communities in the United States. If we look at Euro-American communities, organized recovery really dates to the 1830s. As people today we would know as alcohol dependent began to seek out early temperance societies and use those societies as a framework. I've actually got the first collection of recovery case studies in the United States in a pamphlet from 1833 by Sigourney and Smith that virtually catalogs these sort of reform case studies in the pre-Washingtonian years in the United States. In April of 1840, 6 men that were part of a drinkers club in Baltimore, Maryland, were sitting around one evening, as they did every evening, drinking and debating. And the debate this evening was on the proposition that all temperance lectures were hypocrites. And they decided that since there was a lecture on temperance that very evening, they would send out a subcommittee to research this. Can you imagine this happening? I think we probably could. The subcommittee goes, here's the lecture, comes back, a lively discussion ensues, and the upshot of that is a decision that they should start their own temperance society, but only for hard cases. Now, the term alcoholism hasn't yet been coined, but hard cases was the contemporary term for what we would later call alcoholism. That movement grew from these 6 men to more than 400,000 people within 48 months, and then almost disintegrated overnight. And the alcoholics in that movement went underground and began to organize recovery-focused fraternal temperance societies, closed societies organized by and for recovering alcoholics that functioned very well as sobriety-based frameworks for recovery, became very closed groups and quite elitist in their orientations. I actually have documents describing some of these groups who only wanted drunkards of good repute to be part of their societies. There may actually be a few of those groups still around. I will leave you to make that call. By the time we get to the 1870s, we have a new recovery framework emerges, which is the Ribbon Reform Clubs that's going to begin in the Northeast and rapidly spread south and begin to spread then into the Midwest. We're going to get other groups like the Dashaways in San Francisco. One of my favorite groups is the Drunkards Club in New York City. The point that I want to make here is we have a very large number of pre-AA alcoholic mutual aid societies. We also had societies emerge within the context of a growing network of addiction treatment programs in the 19th century. The first of these is the Alapod Club, organized within the New York State Inebriate Asylum. And we would have the Godwin Association and others. The largest of these is the Keeley Leagues, which were organized in the early 1890s and went on to have more than 30,000 members associated with the growing network of Keeley Institutes across the United States. This is an image of Keeley League Number 1 in Dwight, Illinois, sitting over the banner, which was part of the advocacy message that came out. We're going to talk later about a new recovery advocacy movement. We had advocacy as a major theme among the Keeley Leagues. In 1895, they're going to march on the capital of the state of Pennsylvania, lobbying for a Keeley law that would provide state funds to pay for indigents to receive the Keeley cure who could not personally afford it. We also, as we began to see the growth of treatment in the United States, we actually have a very elaborate network of treatment in the 19th century. We have the early inebriate homes that's going to begin in this city in 1857 with the opening of a home for the fallen. I always think of I've fallen and I can't get up every time I say that. That home is going to open and close fairly quickly, but reopen under the banner of the Boston Washingtonian Home. And the Washingtonian Home in Boston and Chicago will be two of the premier inebriate homes in the United States, with both of those continuing well into the modern era. We're also going to have much more medically directed inebriate asylums. And this is going to begin with the opening of the New York State Inebriate Asylum in 1864. They're going to be, again, much more medically oriented than recovery focused. They're going to involve very physical methods of treatment, prolonged treatment, often legally mandated commitments for treatment, anywhere from 1 to 2 years. We're also going to have private for-profit addiction cure institutes that each are going to compete with one another for who can cure addiction the fastest with the least amount of hypodermic injections and vomiting. I will describe later a few of these. We're also going to have boxed and bottled home cures, the same proprietary drug industry that's going to addict large numbers of American citizens with opium and morphine and cocaine and alcohol-laced patent medicines, is then going to begin to offer cures for the alcohol, tobacco, and drug habits, nearly all of which will be loaded with alcohol, opium, morphine, cocaine, chloral hydrate, etc. We're going to see urban missions and rural inebriate colonies, which is in many ways the beginning of specialty sector faith-based recovery in the United States. And this is really going to begin with Jerry McCauley's work and the urban mission movement in New York City and the arrival of the Salvation Army and their special ministry to late-stage urban alcoholics in the 1880s. We're going to see during this time also specialized treatment for women. We tend to think of that as a relatively modern development, but we had specialized institutions exclusively for the treatment of addicted women. The shame related to this was so great, however, that many of the women entering treatment did so under assumed names, and even their physicians did not know their true identities. We're going to have a growing professionalization of this network of treatment, with the founding in 1870 of the American Association for the Study and Cure of Inebriety, the first scientific journal in addiction. The Journal of Inebriety is going to begin publication in 1875. And this entire movement is going to reach its heydays in the 1880s and 1890s. This is the image, this is the building, the New York State Inebriate Asylum. It's rather stunning to me when I think of the broken down Victorian homes that my first treatment programs existed in, to look back in 1864 and realize that facilities like this once existed. This is a typical cure for the private addiction cure institutes. You'll see the liquor habit is cured in 3 days, but it takes 10 to 14 days to cure morphine addicts. These are typical, some of the typical kind of miracle cures for alcoholism and drug dependence. This is one of my favorites, called 32 glass vials. You take a vial a day for 32 days. You're promised complete comfort in your detoxification and that the craving for alcohol will be forever destroyed. My only question to you was, would you trust a cure coming from a place called Pandora Laboratories? It was very common in these days to see very aggressive advertising by the pharmaceutical industry. Morphine, painless home cure, painless and permanent, providing some new miracle ingredient. Nearly all of these contain morphine, and most of them contain morphine at higher numbers of grains than most people were addicted. So in the name of treating addiction, people actually developed even more intractable addictions. And my point with this is the theme of harm in the name of help has a very, very long tradition in the history of addiction treatment. This widely spreading movement virtually collapsed in the late days of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And there were many things that contributed to this collapse. Ideological splits in the field. Sound familiar? A lack of science-grounded treatments. At the time, a spotlight was shown on this field, and there was a demand for scientific evidence behind claims of things like 100% cures. There simply was no scientific evidence to provide. The field had leaders who in the 1860s and 70s birthed this field and nurtured it into maturation as they matured in their careers, only to then have, as the field faced incredible crises, the aging leaders had disengaged or lost energy and had not dealt with the issue of leadership succession and leadership development within the field. So in some ways, you could say this field died of old age, a phenomenon that actually could be replicated in the next decade if we're not extremely careful. There were also economic depressions that blindsided this field and forced policymakers and philanthropists to make very tough decisions around the allocation of these resources. Does any of this sound familiar to anyone? But more than anything else, that collapse of early treatment came from this culture literally losing faith in the prospects of long-term recovery. Behind 100 claims of these 95 and 100% cures, how long do you think it took before everyone in the culture knew someone for whom treatment had not worked? And with that growing pessimism came a radically different decision in this culture. What we said as a culture was, let's let the existing alcoholics and addicts die off, and the sooner the better. And we're going to prevent the creation of a new generation by legally prohibiting the sale of alcohol and aggressively and legally controlling the distribution of opium, morphine, cocaine, chloral hydrate, and the newly arriving barbiturates.